In the summer of 1953, a British jet crossed into Soviet airspace, flying at over 50,000 feet. Soviet radar tracked it immediately. MiG-15s climbed as high as their engines let them, fired what they could, and fell away. One burst connected. The Canberra shook, but the crew stayed on mission. They were photographing a Soviet missile test site the West had only heard rumors about. No American aircraft could have reached that target. The Canberra did, and the British government, to this day, officially denies it ever happened. In the late 1940s, Britain was rebuilding cities and rearming squadrons at the same time. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had collapsed into rivalry, and by the Berlin blockade in 1948, planners were already treating a European air campaign against the USSR as a live scenario. The Me-262 had demonstrated that with jet propulsion, speed could reduce vulnerability, and piston bombers built for the war against Germany would not last long against radar-directed guns and fighters climbing to meet them. For that reason, the Air Ministry wanted a jet bomber that could replace aircraft like the Mosquito. They needed something fast, high-flying, and able to cross defended airspace before interceptors could climb to meet it. The requirement first went to English Electric, better known for locomotives and heavy industry. And yet, the Air Ministry had faith in them. During the war, the company had run a major aircraft operation in Lancashire, producing bombers such as the Handley Page Hampton and Halifax at scale. English Electric also had Teddy Pedder, a proven designer from Westland, whose earlier aircraft included the Lysander and the cannon-arm Whirlwind. Pedder treated the new bomber as a performance problem, not a fortress. He cut defensive weight, dropped turrets and guns, and bet the aircraft's survival on pace and height rather than armor. The resulting machine looked unlike the heavy bombers of the day. It had a clean fuselage, a high-aspect wing, and engines buried in the wing roots to keep drag down. The layout was built to climb hard. Any interceptor coming after it would start the chase already behind. On May 13, 1949, the first prototype, VN-799, flew with Roland Beaumont at the controls. It handled well enough to convince the Air Ministry to push the program forward. Early flights also exposed problems. Control refinements were then made to the rudder and elevator to reduce buffeting and improve handling. The path to a proper bombing system also took a detour, since the intended H-2S Mark 9 radar wasn't available in time, so production aircraft adopted a glazed nose to accommodate a bomb aimer instead. More powerful Avon variants became standard, and wingtip tanks were added to extend its range. Whatever the Canberra was, it did not look like the bomber jets they were expecting. In May 1951, the first operational Canberras arrived at RAF Binbrook. A No. 101 squadron began bringing the type into service. Bomber Command had been built around aircraft like the Lincoln, where Merlin engines signaled everything through vibration and long run-ups before takeoff. The Canberra behaved nothing like that. Its Rolls-Royce Avons were brought to life by a cartridge start system that snapped into action, pushed smoke across the dispersal, and climbed straight into a hard, continuous whine. The aircraft began to move as soon as thrust came in, making ground crews rethink spacing around intakes and exhaust, and pushing air crews to adapt to a bomber that went from shutdown to taxi power in moments. To soften the transition, crews moving from Lincolns and other piston bombers were first sent to the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter, to learn what jet thrust and higher approach speeds felt like. Only then did crews step into a dual-control Canberra trainer. The trap was takeoff, especially without a horizon. In daylight, the pilot could cross-check the climb visually. At night, or in low visibility, that reference disappears, and the instruments become the only guide. Right after rotation, the Canberra picked up speed, fast enough to shove the pilot into the seat, and that could feel like the nose was coming up too much. If the pilot reacted to that sensation instead of the altitude indicator, he might nudge the control column forward. In the first seconds after liftoff, that small input could flatten the climb or turn it into a descent. The RAF introduced the dual-control Canberra T4 in the mid-1950s to make conversion safer, placing instructor and student side by side with full controls. Even then, training units began to see a repeatable accident pattern. The sorties looked routine at the start. The aircraft rolled, rotated, and climbed away normally. Then, shortly after clearing the airfield boundary, a descending impact with no time for recovery. The response was not a redesign of the airframe so much as a redesign of the training. In that sense, the Canberras forced the RAF to become more methodical about how its new power was handled before crews could safely use what the aircraft could do. At the same time, in the early 1950s, it also became a demonstration aircraft. These flights were not staged solely for spectacle. Britain needed to prove it was still a serious jet power. On February 21, 1951, a Canberra B-2 departed RAF Aldergrove in Northern Ireland and turned west across the North Atlantic, relying entirely on its internal fuel. For more than 2,000 statute miles, it flew over open ocean, with no safe diversion within reach. After just over 4 hours in the air, the Canberra touched down at Gander, Newfoundland, becoming the first jet aircraft to complete a non-stop, unrefueled transatlantic flight. The next year, on August 26, 1952, a prototype Canberra B-5 took off from RAF Aldergrove for Gander, crossed the Atlantic, landed only long enough to refuel, then turned immediately and flew straight back to the UK. The round trip took 10 hours 3 minutes, becoming the first double transatlantic crossing completed by a jet on that out-and-back basis. From there, the records moved from range to altitude. In much of the 1950s, the Canberra could outclimb the effective reach of many would-be interceptors, and the RAF used that as a public proof point. On May 4, 1953, a Canberra B-2, WD-952, modified with Rolls-Royce Olympus engines, climbed into the thin air and set a world altitude record of 63,668 feet. It wasn't a steady cruise upward. As the Canberra climbed, engine thrust fell away, and the air thinned, reducing lift, forcing the crew to hold a narrow performance margin while the aircraft edged toward its ceiling. Finally, on October 9, 1953, it won the London Christchurch Air Race, reaching New Zealand in just under 24 hours, a long-distance sprint that has stood for decades. It was about this time that Washington noticed. Within weeks of the USAF's 1951 evaluations, the service approved license production of the Canberra by the Glenn L. Martin Company, B-57 in American markings. After the record flights, the Canberra stopped being just Bomber Command's new bomber. And now, there was an obvious customer interested in the aircraft, and they were people who needed photographs from places no one was supposed to reach. In early 1953, Western intelligence received reports from German scientists who had been taken to the Soviet Union after the war and were now returning home. They described a missile development and test center at Kapustin Yar, roughly 60 miles east of Stalingrad, now Volgograd on the Volga River. If the accounts were accurate, the Soviet Union was advancing ballistic missile work at a pace that demanded confirmation. Washington needed photographs to confirm these rumors, but it did not have an aircraft capable of reaching that far into Soviet territory and returning. London did. A request reached Prime Minister Winston Churchill during the summer. The British agreed to support a deep reconnaissance effort using an RAF Canberra B-2 or PR-3, stripped of unnecessary weight and fitted for high-altitude photography. The launch point was a U.S. base in West Germany near Würzburg. Before dawn, the Canberra lifted off and headed east on a planned route that cut across Central Europe and Ukraine, toward Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Stalingrad. The aircraft settled into cruise at roughly 46,000 to 48,000 feet, the altitude chosen to push beyond the comfortable reach of most Soviet interceptors. And still, Soviet radar stations detected the intruder almost immediately. After being alerted, MiG-15s climbed hard in pursuit. Some of them clawed up to the Canberra's height, long enough to fire short bursts from their 23mm cannon. After each pass, they lost speed and had to drop away to recover. The Canberra refused to fight the MiG started. It stayed high and steady. As it neared Kapustin Yar, cannon fire from one of the MiGs hit the airframe, and the aircraft shook. The damage didn't cripple it, but the vibration threw off the camera system, blurring frames and making them less useful. Even so, the crew held altitude and finished the photo run over the test range. Rather than retracing a route the Soviet radar stations were already watching, the Canberra continued south and flew roughly 772 miles into Iran, following a pre-planned escape leg that carried it away from the densest interceptor response. After an extraordinary flight of around 2,500 miles deep inside Soviet airspace, the aircraft landed on friendly ground. Analysts used the film that came along as proof that the test site existed. It confirmed activity and risk, even though the picture quality was not the best. It also proved that altitude made the Canberra difficult to engage, but not completely impervious. To this day, the British government has publicly denied that such a mission took place. By the autumn of 1956, Canberra squadrons were forward deployed in the Mediterranean, operating from dispersed pads on Malta and Cyprus as tensions around Egypt surged. The spark was President Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, a move that threatened British and French influence and pushed both governments toward military action. Britain and France began shaping an air campaign meant to cripple the Egyptian Air Force and clear room for intervention. On the night of October 31st, 1956, Valiance and Canberra struck Egyptian airfields. Al-Maza and Inchas near Cairo, and Abu Suir and Kabrit in the Canal Zone, aiming to crater runways and disrupt aircraft on the ground before daylight operations expanded. They bombed without seeing the target, relying on the clock and the instruments. In blackout conditions and broken cloud, crews committed to the run and accepted a hard rule. Once the release point was gone, so was the chance to correct anything. In the last few seconds, real targets blurred into decoys and look-alike buildings. Usually, altitude kept the Canberras out of range of light and anti-aircraft fire, but heavy guns could still reach it. Defenders tried to organize night intercepts, but the handoffs rarely happened fast enough to get a fighter onto the bomber before it crossed the target. But altitude solved one problem, only to create another. Flying high reduced exposure, yet it also widened the margin of error at the target. High-altitude bombing could damage a runway, but repair crews could fill the craters and reopen it. That's why, as the campaign went on, pressure grew to increase effectiveness. Some attacks went lower, trading safety margin for a better chance of decisive hits, but bringing the Canberra closer to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. By that point, militarily, the Egyptian Air Force was heavily damaged in the opening strikes. However, on the political side, much of the world read the intervention as an attempt to reverse nationalization by force. And anger sharpened, as the sequencing suggested prearranged coordination. The US feared the invasion would inflame the region and weaken its stance, while the Soviets were cracking down in Hungary. So Washington pressed London and Paris hard, and as Britain's financial situation worsened, it used that leverage to impose a deadline. It taught Bomber Command that in modern war, the fight was never only over targets. It was also over what those targets meant once the world reacted. That same year, the Canberra was back on reconnaissance along the eastern Mediterranean, running the edge of Syrian airspace as tensions rose after Suez. London wanted hard intelligence on Syrian airfields, troop concentrations, and signs of growing Soviet influence. The aircraft were PR-7 variants, stripped for cameras in range. The routes were deliberate and often repeated. They came in over the coast near Latakia, ran inland over Aleppo and Homs toward Damascus, then bent back west over Beirut and out to Cyprus. It was efficient for photography and navigation, and it was also a pattern that Syrian police units stationed along the frontier could easily follow. Syria lacked the radar and ground control system needed to run consistent high-altitude interceptions. What it did have was telephones. Squadron leader Tahir Zaki helped set up a simple network where police lookouts reported unfamiliar aircraft by landline. Local headquarters then relayed the calls, and Major Mukhabri stitched the reports into a track, then vectored fighters toward the point the intruder had to cross. November 6, 1956, was the day when a phone call traveled faster than a Canberra. A PR-7 lifted off from Cyprus on a reconnaissance sortie. At around 8 a.m., a Syrian meteor intercepted and opened fire. The Canberra escaped back to Cyprus, but it returned without the required photographs, and headquarters demanded an immediate second attempt. Flight Lieutenant Bernie Hunter took it personally. On the second run, he tried to work under the cloud. He dropped to 12,000 feet, then 10,000 to get the overlap the cameras needed. Meanwhile, in Syria, meteor pilots had already been sitting strapped in for hours waiting for him, ready to climb into position when the phone report said the Canberra had crossed Homs. Hunter did not know any of that. He only saw the moment the clouds broke. His formation was heading toward Damascus, and suddenly there was blue sky, perfect visibility, and total exposure. When Hunter pushed the throttles forward and tried to climb back into cover, the meteors were already there. Hunter turned into the attacks to spoil their aim, but each turn bled speed and flattened the climb. The cloud stayed just out of reach. Then the starboard engine took hits and began burning. Hunter tried to get his crew to eject. With one engine out, control fading, and the aircraft dropping low, Hunter pulled his own handle. He ejected so low that there was barely time for the seat to work. Above him, the Canberra carried on for seconds on its momentum, then fell to the Syrian ground, where it would be lost. The irony that a British-built Meteor, flown by Syrian pilots, trained under British instruction, had brought down a British reconnaissance aircraft was not lost on them. In response, the PR-9 variant became the RAF sports version of the type. It was a purpose-built, high-altitude reconnaissance machine, designed for a recon game that was getting harsher by the late 1950s. Soviet interceptors were climbing higher. Surface-to-air missiles were getting more capable. American high-altitude recon aircraft were already operating above 70,000 feet, and the RAF needed a platform that could climb to the top of its own envelope and still return usable imagery. Where earlier bomber Canberras were built around the bomb bay, the PR-9 was a substantial redesign aimed at altitude. The prototype was created by converting an existing PR-7. On July 8, 1955, the prototype flew in its new configuration, rebuilt with a revised wing and more power. Up close, the PR-9 looked like a different machine. It received Rolls-Royce Avon RA-27 engines, rated at 11,250 pounds of thrust each. Official paperwork described 60,000 feet or higher, though service reality tended to settle closer to about 58,000 feet. The aircraft lived inside a narrow airspeed band. Too slow and it would stall. Too fast and it risked pushing past the safe Mach limit. That sensitivity drove hardware choices. It became the only production Canberra with fully power-boosted flight controls and a proper autopilot. The pilot sat under an offset fighter-style canopy instead of the older greenhouse. The navigator rode in a separate nose compartment with hinged access. The first production PR-9, which flew on July 27, 1958, suffered a catastrophic structural failure over Liverpool Bay. The navigator position in that early aircraft had no ejection seat, and the loss forced a redesign featuring an upward-firing Martin Baker ejection seat to ensure both crew could escape. The PR-9 entered service with No. 58 Squadron at RAF Whiten in January 1960 and quickly settled into a long pattern of Mediterranean and Middle East watchkeeping, rotating through Malta and Cyprus. It tracked Soviet warships and regional flashpoints. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, it flew Ruby missions, photographing Soviet shipping. By the 1970s, upgrades added long-range oblique electro-optical imagery alongside changing camera fits, allowing multiple systems to be carried at once for different angles and tasks. It survived into the satellite and drone era because it was quick to task and could return with evidence. Late in its life, the Canberra's value wasn't what it could bomb. It was what it could confirm. By the late 1950s, RAF Germany faced a hard imbalance. Warsaw Pact forces in East Germany outnumbered NATO in tanks, artillery, and short-range aircraft. If war came, British planners did not believe conventional bombing alone would stop an armored thrust across the North German plain. NATO's answer was early nuclear use to blunt an advance before it broke through. If the klaxon sounded, the expectation was minutes, not hours. To prepare for such an event, Canberras were sent to fly through the radioactive cloud of Britain's atomic test in Australia. In 1953, after each detonation, one waited at a safe distance while the plume climbed and spread. Once controllers thought the timing was right, the Canberra turned in and climbed into the area with filter paper sampling gear to trap radioactive particles. Once they entered the cloud, the visibility dropped fast, and fine dust and debris rattled the airframe. The static and electrical noise could mess with radios and instruments too. Radiation levels were tracked, but exposure control was mostly procedural, following a planned time window and a defined route, with a hard exit once the samples were taken. After landing, the aircraft was treated as contaminated equipment, not a normal returning sortie. Ground crews in protective gear washed the airframe down. Filters and collection cartridges were removed and sealed, then sent for lab work immediately. Flight crews were monitored, and in some cases, exposure came close to or exceeded earlier estimates. Under Project E, American nuclear weapons were kept in Europe and allocated to RAF units, including Canberra squadrons. It was a political arrangement as much as a technical one. The scale rose again in 1957 during the hydrogen bomb tests on Christmas Island. The clouds were larger and higher, so some Canberras received rocket-assisted boosters to climb into thinner air and sample upper layers of the plume. The debris confirmed actual yield and performance, and the sampling mapped how fallout behaved in bands and layers, data that fed directly into prediction models and planning for operations in contaminated conditions. Several years later, on April 2, 1982, Argentine forces landed on the Falkland Islands, triggering a war neither side had planned to fight at that distance. As Britain assembled a naval task force and began a long transit south, Argentina leaned on what it already had. Among them were English Electric Canberra bombers, bought in the early 1970s to replace the Avro Lincoln. 10 Canberra B-62s and 2 T-64 trainers were on hand. When combat began, 8 of those bombers were serviceable. They operated from Toulouse, roughly 670 miles from the islands, close enough to reach the fight, far enough to avoid the vulnerability of the southernmost bases. When the air war opened on May 1st, their Canberras launched on long overwater legs that demanded careful fuel management. That same day, a Sea Harrier from 801st Naval Air Squadron intercepted Canberra B-110. An AIM-9L Sidewinder hit the aircraft, resulting in both crewmen being ejected into the South Atlantic. Neither crewman was recovered. The lesson was immediate. The Canberra could still carry weight, but it had few answers once a modern fighter closed in, especially if it was a missile that could engage for more than a tail chase. From that point forward, staying alive dictated how the Canberras were used. Argentine crews flew 54 sorties, including 36 bombing runs, and many of those attacks moved to night operations. They came in toward Port Stanley and San Carlos Bay on timed headings at low altitude, navigating by dead reckoning over open water where there were few visual cues. Instead of aiming at something they could clearly see, they often released bombs on mapped coordinates and suspected troop areas. On June 13th, Canberra B-108 climbed to around 39,000 feet for a strike against British ground forces. HMS Exeter detected it and fired a Sea Dart missile. The Canberra was hit. Captain Roberto Pastran ejected and was captured. It was the last Argentine aircraft lost in combat before the surrender the next day. The Falklands marked the Canberra's last bombing war. The aircraft that once relied on altitude now faced missiles, radar, and alliances that could decide its fate before it ever reached the target. In the spring of 2003, the air war over Iraq was moving faster than planners could verify. Coalition strike aircraft hit airfields, command sites, air defense nodes, and Republican Guard positions, then cycled on to the next target. Hours later, commanders needed proof of what was still standing, what was burning, what had already been patched, and what had been moved. Satellites helped, but they weren't always available on the exact timeline a tasking cell needed, and they couldn't always be steered onto a specific patch of ground at a specific moment. Early unmanned coverage was an option, but it still wasn't a universal replacement for a long-endurance reconnaissance jet that could be launched on demand with a defined track and camera plan. So the request went in for PR-9 Canberras. They were known to be dependable, fast retasked, and capable of climbing to working height, then holding a disciplined photographic run that produced repeatable results. During Operation Telek, PR-9s worked from Basra in the August to September 2003 window. In just 6 weeks, tasking produced 6,368 prints, 239 photo mosaics, and more than 600 maps, much of it focused on survey mapping and panoramic coverage for the British area of responsibility. A widely repeated anecdote stated that from roughly 47,000 feet over Basra, their imagery was sharp enough to show skid marks from a vehicle crash on a bomb-damaged bridge. On a battlefield filled with satellites and UAVs, staff still asked for a 50-year-old jet because they trusted what it brought back, and trusted it enough to plan around it. No other airplane at the time could achieve roughly 2,000 nautical miles of range while carrying 4 complementary imaging systems at once and operating around 50,000 feet for up to 5 hours. 3 years later, in 2006, the PR-9 was still flying operational missions over Afghanistan. But by the mid-2000s, the biggest threat to the PR-9 was wear. The pressure bulkhead, a critical structural ring in the fuselage, was showing signs of fatigue that would require substantial money and engineering effort to fix. At the same time, the upward-firing ejection seats were getting harder to keep certified under modern standards. The training situation tightened after the last Canberra T-4 trainer left service in 2005. leaving fewer avenues to safely bring new crews onto the type. Money and supportability closed that trap. By the end, the squadron cost was significant, close to £15 million for No. 39 Squadron. And there was no realistic budget appetite to fund both the structural work and the certification effort required to keep an aging fleet operating at the tempo commanders still wanted. In the end, paperwork did what fighters and missiles couldn't. The final PR-9 flight landed at Kemble on July 31, 2006. The PR-9 did not stop being useful. It left because keeping it safe, legal, and supportable had finally become more than the RAF could justify. Across 55 years, 782 Canberras flew in RAF colors and had served the nation well, but by 2006, the service had reached the point where it had to retire. No one designed it to last. It lasted anyway, until the calendar finally won.